series and characters, and it's all very much based in the Lovecraftian mythos. It's very inspired by Lovecraft and the settings and the creatures and the sort of feel. But he puts a twist on it, which we'll get to, which I think is interesting. But I did want to get right into it because we started talking, and as usually happens, I run out of time. He wasn't able to come into the studio tonight, so I did catch up with him yesterday, and this was our... Wait a second, I'll see if I can make Metallica be a little quieter. So this was our conversation. You have, I guess, a trilogy or a 5-book set, depending on whether it's electronic or hard copy.
That's right.
As well as a book of poetry out, as well as a sort of published short story ebook.
Yes.
And that's it so far for
That's
you.
it so far, yeah. I'm working on a 4th for the series, or 6th, depending on how you want to look at it.
Right.
But that's in the works right now. That's not happening yet.
Right. Okay, so I guess lobbing the easy softball question first. Where does this come from? Why did you start writing the Symbiote series?
The original book, The Symbiote, it began with a nightmare, believe it or not. And the nightmare wasn't really, you'd never recognize it to what the final product is, but it ended up giving birth to a short story, and the first chapter is that short story in itself. And then at that point, it expanded into the full novella that the Symbiote is. And I've always had ideas for the second and the final one. The second one was, the Symbiote was written probably about 20 years ago, and it sat in the drawer for the longest time. And it was my daughter that said, I have a background in printing. And she said, why don't you just take the next step and publish it? And it's funny, the wisdom of children, because you don't make those connections. Mm-hmm. And I did that. And then the second one, The Hunt Symbiosis, was half written at that time. And I had the entire story mapped out. It just never, I had to sit down and actually do it. I finished writing that one the beginning of last year. And then I've always had the idea for the final one, Necropolis, in my mind, but I had a couple of stumbling blocks that I just couldn't. I kept hitting a wall, couldn't figure out a way around it. And then it's funny when you get that germ of an idea like that, it takes off. And then I think it took me about 13 months to write that one finally. And that was out this year. But the reason why, like you said, in print edition, it's three books. And ebook editions, it's 5. In Necropolis is 3 separate books in it. And how that kind of came to fruition was, in Necropolis, the stories evolved to, there's probably about 7 or 8 main characters. Not all good guys, but it's become complicated. And it takes place in ancient Egypt in an archaeological dig in 1925 and in the now. And it jumps back and forth throughout the whole thing. And with that many characters, I was getting confused. And then initially, I had broken it down into, and I had no real names for that at that point. It was like a prologue, the main body, and an epilogue. And I didn't like those terms. And then it was just Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and eventually evolved into, why don't we just call them Book 3, part of the series, Book 3, 4, and 5.
Right.
And that's how it evolved in those separate ebooks.
So they sort of stand then on their own.
They can.
But are intertwined with each other.
Yeah. They're more closely connected than the other two are, although they're all in the same series. Like the overarching title of the third one is Necropolis. All the ebooks are Necropolis Book 1, Pharaoh, Necropolis Book 2, Hybrids, Necropolis Book 3, Relay. Mm-hmm. Although they are broken down. They're one entitled, one whole piece. That's the plan, at least.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I think struck me as interesting about the whole series, is that it seems like it's all conceived as one story, and yet lots of mini short stories, lots of separate ideas, lots of things intertwining. Like you said, a lot of different main characters. Yeah. So how do you keep track of all of that? Or do you kind of just write it and then look back and go, how does this interact?
I know them so well. The funny thing about that is you get to know them too well. I don't want to give a lot away in it. And like I said, with the second book, The Hunt Symbiosis, one of the characters, I had half written it and had parked. And I knew with the storyline, one of the characters has to die. It's critical to how the story progresses. But when it came down to actually starting to write it, you get closer and closer. You almost know this person. I got to the point where I didn't want them to die. I didn't want you know that has to happen anyway for the story to continue. And you kind of, it's not heartbreaking, but they start taking on the life of their own.
But admittedly, if the author doesn't want this character to die, then you know the reader is even less going to want them to die. Right?
I hope
because
so.
The author has a purpose to all of this, and the reader would just be like, "No, don't kill this." Yeah. So you can sort of hope that that's going on in the reader's mind anyway.
Yeah, I think so. I hope so. Yeah.
And clearly, obviously, just even from the titles, Lovecraft inspired, set in the Lovecraft mythos.
Yes.
Why is that where you go? Like why
I've always
Lovecraft?
been intrigued with Lovecraft's work. I think I first encountered him in, I guess it was towards the end of high school. And I consumed almost everything I could get my hands on. Read. And the thing that's funny with him, for people out there, if you're not familiar with him, his vocabulary is incredible. And when you start, especially at high school level, if you start reading his work, you'll probably begin reading 2 books at the same time, whatever the given book you're chosen to read, and a dictionary, because he'll use words that you can't fake your way through it. You need to know them. And it's a good learning curve.
Yeah.
But I've always liked the concept of, and I've asked this a lot when people ask, well, what are they? Well, they're horror. And you see the look on the face. Horror is kind of a hit and miss thing. I always like describing it as it's not horror in the sense of splatter and gore. It's more cerebral. And I find a lot of time, not so much in literature necessarily today, but in movies, what we accept as horror today, it's shock, it's splatter, it's gory. It's not like you look at Hitchcock, although he's more thriller than suspense and horror. Hitchcock understood that your imagination can paint a picture worse than any words could describe. And he went with that all the time. And I like that angle. Like, that's where I think true horror really exists. H.P. Lovecraft wrote a essay called Supernatural Horror in Literature, in which he defines, he categorizes fear as in instinctive fear and supernatural fear. And instinctive fear is, a good example of it is, it's nighttime, you're in the forest, you're being chased by wolves, you're alone, you're running, you're scared. Of course you're scared, but you know what they are, you know what they're going to do to you. That's not horror, that's fear. Horror is something different than that. Now, he doesn't go into a whole lot of detail as to mapping out what that is, but he'll give you a clear definition of the difference between fear and horror.
Well, and he does start out that essay with the oldest and deepest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown.
That's right.
You know that the wild animals are out there. You know what they are, and you know what they will do.
That's right.
With the things that you are afraid of in a supernatural horror situation, you have no idea what that is.
You can't prepare.
Yeah. So, working within the mythos, though, because you do have to kind of pick and choose what style. There are many different kinds of Lovecraftian mythoses out there now. There are people who are all about the elder gods. There are people who are all about the insanity or whatever.
Right.
What do you pick out of Lovecraft?
Myself?
What is what is?
That's a hard question. I recently, it was somebody on Goodreads pointed this out to me, and it's funny how you don't even see it yourself. If you look at the Symbiote series as the whole, generally Lovecraftian horror deals with the unknown, or like we're saying, the unknowable even. Often the main characters they're isolated, they're recluses, they're academics. Almost always male. You never see female. They're incidental characters, but you don't see them as primarily a character in his novels at all. What I noticed in the Symbiote series in the beginning, in the first book, the main character definitely fits that category for sure. And it's ironic where you get a progress towards and away from it. By the time you get to the final books in Necropolis, the majorities of the main characters, both protagonists and antagonists, are female. And they're not damsels in distresses. They are incredibly... And I didn't do that on purpose. It's just the way it evolved into. And it's the turning point is in the second book, The Hunt Symbiosis, where I'm going back after and looking at that. It's that one character I said that has to die. That's the turning point. And in that sense, it recedes away from the Lovecraftian horror because the main characters cease to be recluse. They cease to be academics. They cease to be male only. But the other thing about it, and I don't want to give a lot away, and hopefully this will whet people's appetite, there's this hint of full-blown Lovecraftian monsters, this undertow that comes up. And by the time you get to the end in Necropolis, they're there. They're full out. We get to see the monsters. We get to see the horrors, and they're...
Well, the last book is called Relay, right?
Yeah.
So that's the sunken city.
That is it, yes.
Of the ancient old ones.
Well, the challenging thing about that is, and I'll say this up front, I do bring the characters directly to the city of Relay. What I didn't realize until after I started doing the mechanics of writing it was in Lovecraft, in the Call of Cthulhu, we see a small glimmer of Relay in it. But the thing is, it's told from a third person's point of view. We're reading the testimony of somebody else's. So all the weird angles and bizarre things that the city he can't describe, Lovecraft himself doesn't have to, because we're hearing a testimony of somebody else telling the story, which is ingenious because he doesn't have to flesh that out. I didn't realize that until I got into it, and I went, oh no, now I'm stuck with having to... It became a challenge.
Having to describe it.
How do you describe it? Because in the case of the fifth book, the characters are there in the first person, and you're dealing with that, and you need to flesh that out. And I had to come up with quasi-science, trying to figure out what was... It's not, none of this stuff is actually in the books, but I had to figure out what I believe was happening to cause these to begin with, so you could see the side effects of it.
Right.
And I went with it from that angle. But
so you're filling out sort of the background.
Inevitably, it wasn't my intention, but that's what ended up happening, yeah.
In order to describe something that your characters will find indescribable.
That's right.
Yeah. That's, I think, one of the tricks with... there is a level of insanity that runs through Lovecraft as well. You know, that people do tend to, lose their minds in the face of this stuff, and that must be difficult to write.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, there's one I've always liked in the, especially more so in the first book than any of the other ones. The storyline jumps a lot. From different people's perspectives, there's a lot of times it's like starting a new short story. You're best to approach it that way, because don't try to figure out, just go with it. And then it slowly but surely things start piecing together, but it's that jumping into different perspectives. And, I've always been intrigued with the idea of, in poorly made movies or stories, madness or insanity is clear. Oh, he's crazy. But the very definition of it, well, a great movie of that is Black Swan with Natalie Portman. You're watching somebody descend into the madness, and at what point is it not reality anymore? Now, the very nature of insanity is you can't identify it when it happens, because if you can point your finger at it and say, oh, that's it, well, you're probably not going there.
Yeah, yeah. There's another theme that I thought was pretty much drawn straight from the Lovecraft canon that runs through the book, and that's music.
Yes.
So why does music, it sort of underpins the book?
It does, yeah. It hinges on, well, I mean, in the initial event in the first book, what happens is the main character is a master pianist. He's jaded, he's bored with music today, he's frustrated with it, he thinks there's something more and beyond it, and he finds an old piece of music, and its composer, he traces his composer's ancestry down to the current day, and when he gets together with her in England. This is the first chapter, so I'm not giving a lot away.
Right.
When they finally figured out and perform it, it wasn't a piece of music that was lost from history. It was a piece of music that was removed from history, because of what it does, it opens a portal outside of our universe and lets something out that shouldn't have been, and that's the trigger event that everything starts falling apart after that. But the music itself is a reference to the music of Eric Zahn. It's a short story from Lovecraft, and if you haven't read it, you can download it for free. It's worth the read. It's fantastic. I've always had a taste in music. I've played piano. I used to play drums, and I think there's something with music that's instinctive. I think it's part of the human condition. Everybody can relate to it on some level. We might not like all music, but everybody likes some kind of music.
Yeah. Well, and it has, there have been studies about how much music has an effect on, your brain. It can actually physically affect your brain. And
Change
there's a
your
thing about
moods
certain people apparently get chills when they listen to music and other people don't. I just discovered this.
Okay.
And I thought of that idea of that happens so much in Lovecraft, where artists are super sensitive.
That's right.
Right. And so they tend to respond to the supernatural in sort of unconscious ways.
Yeah. They can plug into it. Yeah, Pickman's model is a great example of it, and it's littered throughout his work.
Yeah, yeah. So the idea of the artist is, I don't know, somehow being
well, you know,
susceptible.
It's funny you say that with the artist, whether it's writing, whether it's painting, whether it's drawing, whether it's music, that creative process in itself, I've always seen it as, it's terrible to say it like this, it's almost like a demon. I believe you can only take a degree of credit for your own work, because that creative thing itself finds its life through you. It expresses itself. You become the medium of it rather than its creator. Sure, you've made it, but I mean, it has a life of its own. And I think he might be touching upon that. Like there's something else at play in there.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess you're sort of, you were talking about some of your characters taking on their own life to the point where you didn't want to kill them off and that kind of thing. And it also seems, just looking at, the short story that you've just put out as well, that might be leading into a future book,
yes.
apparently.
Yes.
So just, I guess, are they kind of snowballing forward into more stories as you go? Has the story decided to take
yes
over?
and no. The fourth one, or sixth, depending on whether ebook or the print edition. Right now, my plan is the title is going to be The Refuge Chronicles, and basically it deals with the human debris of all the events throughout the whole trilogy. There's a lot of secondary characters. There's a lot of incidental characters. We never really find out what happened to them, but a lot of people are interested in them. This basically tells the stories of them. And one example is there's a female RCMP officer who kind of has her mind taken over, and she opens fire on children. We revisit her 7 years later afterwards. She's an alcoholic. And from her point of view, it's not a clean cut. Somebody took me over. I wasn't in control. She sees it as her own choice, her own actions. And there's a handful of characters like this throughout it. And I figured it'd be a nice tying up all the loose ends, and there are a lot of loose ends in this. But the other thing I wanted to do was I wanted to break away from a traditional story where there's chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. In the Refuge Chronicles, I'm aiming, right now I have about 20 short stories. About half are mapped out. There's about 6 that are actually done. A few of them are available as short stories. But they don't have to be read in sequence. You can jump back and forth. They all interconnect somehow, and they tell a larger story. Basically, it's going to be not chapters, it's going to be little vignettes. And I like that challenge because you're a lot more free to write that way.
Yeah. Well, and almost it seems like publishing ebooks, because you've got all of these out as ebooks, gives you some of that freedom as well. It might almost have been part of the inspiration for doing it in little chunks and stories.
It can be.
Because an ebook, you could buy a short story, or you could buy a novella, or the whole collection.
Yeah.
And it can be released as it comes out, so you can sort of, here's some new stuff.
That's right.
Here's more of the story.
Yeah, that's right. Well, one of the short stories, I released it on Goodreads at first. I think it's still available for free, called Mother Machine. And so far, a lot of people like it. It's more atmosphere. It's more creepy than anything else. But a lot of people didn't realize, and I've had a few people on Goodreads be surprised saying, this is part of the Symbiote series. How can it be? And I say, well, you're going to have to wait and see, because it's introducing just small elements. And, in time, they will start coming together. You will start seeing the bigger patterns. Another one that's available right now is a coffee at Bacote's. It was supposed to be coffee at Starbucks, but I'm not allowed to use Starbucks.
Of course.
But that one's out as well, too.
You could always ask Bridgehead if you could use them.
No, I specifically described their logo in it. And
okay. Oh, yes, the Starbucks logo. Yeah. So, thinking about, because they are, I mean, it's a lot of, even the poetry that you have done and these novels and stuff is all, it's horror, it's dark. You're clearly having fun with it.
Absolutely.
What is fun about writing dark and creepy and scary?
You can go places you didn't think you could. It's hard to describe. I don't know. I think one of the things I always get with when it comes to poetry or even art, painting, pictures, whatever, generally I think a lot of people believe by the definition art is something that has to be pretty or beautiful. And I don't think it does. It can be, absolutely, but inspiring doesn't have to be pretty or beautiful. Ultimately, I believe art is supposed to elicit an emotion. And whether that's fear or dread or sorrow or happiness, that's art. And, you know, so many people are more comfortable with the happy and sunshines and lollipops, and that's great, but there's another side to it.
And you're more comfortable with the dark. I'm
more comfortable with the dark.
Well, that's the title of your poetry book, right? A Dark Corner of My Soul?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, which I hadn't read it, but you said that it started out as prose. It started out as a collection of prose that was sitting around, and then you decided to turn it into poetry.
That's right. That was, to be honest with you, A Dark Corner of My Soul was probably the scariest of any of the books for me to put out, because I remember the first time I got print editions of the Symbiote, and the first time I made a connection with the bookstore and made an agreement to drop off copies, the actual act of physically letting them go is scary, because now it's real. Now it's out there. People will see it. They'll think, who knows what they think. There's that fear we have in ourselves. But at the end of the day, it's fiction. It's not real. With the Dark Corner of My Soul, these are poems of myself. That's different, because you feel like you're almost standing naked in front of a world of strangers. It's a very, very intimidating thing to do. Actually, it was probably the reason why I held back so long for doing it, because it's not a comfortable thing. And it was a friend of mine that had said to me, at the end of the day, look at the bigger picture. They don't know you. They won't know you. They'll see it in their own terms, which is great, and I hope they do. But the other side of it, I hope, is people don't look at it and think that's who I am, because those collection of poems came from a very, very dark time, and it's therapeutical to purge that from yourself sometimes. But even when I decided to do going through it and get it prepared and put it together, looking back at it now, you're looking at a different person, and it's almost sobering, thinking, wow, that's where I was. That's the place I found myself, and I'm happy not to be there now. But there is something healthy about getting that out, identifying it, pointing a finger at it and saying, that's dark, that's bad. Let's move forward from that. It's a purging.
Well, and just talking about it in public as well. I mean, there's been a lot of, because the poems are, you know, themes around, you know, mental illness and sort of fairly dark, right? And I guess just talking about it kind of brings it into more people's consciousness.
That's right.
As, you know, this is a reality that people go through.
Well, it allows people to, you know, I like to think I'm not the only one that goes through these things sometimes, but sometimes it could give you permission to feel it. It could say, you know what, this is normal for a lot of people. We go through these dark periods, we go through these up periods, and it's not the end of the world. It is a good thing. Well, maybe not a good thing, but it's a healthy thing. It's a natural process, at least. Yeah.
Well, and if you can, you know, if the reader can relate to that, then maybe they'll sort of be glad to know that there's somebody else.
That's right, yeah.
And if that's not been their experience, then they can get some sense of what it's like, maybe.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's sort of one of the things I think poetry is really good for, is I once said to somebody it was as close to telepathy as you can get with human beings.
That's a good way of putting it. I like
because
that.
Because when you write poetry, you really are trying to sort of, put some kind of mental state down.
That's right.
Maybe not a narrative state, maybe just an impression, maybe just a thing you find fascinating.
Yeah.
But, yeah, so anyway. I will get a hold of the poetry book because I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I do want to read it. So where do people get them?
Right now, well, they're available in ebooks right now. Amazon, Kobo, Barnes & Noble, Google Play, Apple iBooks, and Smashwords all have them. For print copies, there's about 9 locations across the city that are currently carrying them. Perfect Books on Elgin Street, Chapters in Canada. I just did a book signing last weekend there. Black Squirrel Books and Cafe carry them. Cobalt's Corner in Canada carries it. Comet Comics, I always have a hard time saying that. Comet Comics on Bank Street has it. Coles and Billings Bridge carry them. Octopus Books on in the Glebe. Singing Pebble Books, books on Beechwood, and I'm hoping in September they'll be in the Coles and Bayshore as well.
All right. And we were going to do like a free ebook giveaway promotion thing.
That's right.
During this interview, and I'm trying to figure out how we could maybe do that. I'm thinking what you want to do is hit us up at Literary Landscape on CKCU-FM, on CKCU, on Facebook. Just go to Facebook and search Literary Landscape. And should we have a skill testing question?
Sure, but I don't know what it would be.
Your favorite Lovecraft-inspired work.
Oh.
Just comment with your favorite Lovecraft-inspired work.
That's good.
On our Facebook page. Again, just look for Literary Landscape on Facebook. And we will send you the code for a free copy.
Sounds awesome.
All right. Through Smashwords, right? Yeah.
Smashwords, yes.
Yeah. And, so I think that sounds... Maybe we'll get a whole bunch of people coming and telling, giving me some new Lovecraft-inspired. Doesn't have to be by Lovecraft. Can be just in the mythos.
That's right.
And then we can check in and see if there's anything we haven't read yet.
That's cool.
All right. So thanks a whole lot for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
It's been really fun talking to you, and I'm going to go get a hold of a copy of the Book of Poetry.
Awesome.
And, good luck with all of the promotion.
Thank you.
All right. So that was my conversation with Michel Weatherall. And he mentioned afterwards, I said, is there a track that you'd like me to go out on? And he said, well, actually, there's a whole scene in the book in which features ancient Egypt and the modern world, and the track by Metallica, Creeping Death. Could you play that? And so I can't, of course, play all of it because it's like a 6.5-minute track, but I will leave you with Metallica on the way out, and then hand the reins over to Bizarre Bazaar. We'll talk later.